If you're anything like me, then you've probably seen all of the Marvel movies, and you might even have read all the comics that they came from. But then you would know that there have been some things where the movies and the comics were drastically different. Let's check some of these times. How is Iron Man different? Who disappeared from the universe? And so much more. Warning for spoilers ahead. How the Avengers got together. Taking it back to where it started, right when the Avengers met each other and got it all together. In both the books and in the movies, it was Loki that was the reason that they met each other and all got together. But how things played out was pretty different, and a bit more focused on manipulation by Loki. In the movies, it's Nick Fury that introduces everyone and gets them to work together against Loki. But in the movies, Loki doesn't take them on directly, not at first at least. Rather, he tricks Hulk and gets him to rampage in the hope that Thor will try and stop him, and that Hulk will then be able to kill Thor if they fight. But instead of that happening, the group of heroes that eventually come together as the Avengers band together to stop Hulk. This group included Iron Man, Thor, but also Ant-Man and Wasp. They then learned that Loki was behind all of the chaos, and then eventually beat him and stayed together as the Avengers. Pretty different from the movies, right? Iron Man is much worse in the comics. It's hard to imagine Tony Stark being more arrogant and more of a rebel than he is in the movies. But the thing is that in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they have Robert Downey Jr., and he brings so much heart to the character. He makes Tony really charming and even kind of sweet. He might have his quirks and he might think he knows better than everyone else, but we can't help but really love Tony and Iron Man. In the movies, he was a bit of a loner and didn't want to work with the team, but he changes and really becomes the heart of the Avengers. He's really human and sometimes even too caring because their mistakes haunt him, but that's not how we see him in the comics at all. He's completely arrogant and he never really changes. He always seems to think that he's above all the other Avengers and smarter than them. He also makes some massive mistakes that have really critical repercussions for the rest of the Avengers, and he never learns from his mistakes or grows to be a better person. Instead, he just stays as arrogant as ever. Really, the Tony Stark of the comics isn't all that likable, and he never properly becomes part of the team. I love the movie version so much more because of this. The entire universe does not line up. There are still loads of Marvel characters that haven't appeared in the movies. Many of them are some of the smaller characters that live in this comic book world. There are many that you can understand that it will start to get confusing if they use everyone, but there's still time to introduce us to even more characters. But surprisingly, two of our favorite groups actually live in the same universe in the comics, and they don't cross paths at all in the films. The X-Men and the Avengers all actually exist in the same universe, and their paths cross often. In the movies, it doesn't seem like they know about each other at all. This is because of the simple fact that they don't. The rights to these characters aren't held by the same people. Walt Disney Company has the rights to Marvel Studios. They can use the characters that are associated with most of the Marvel comics, but that excludes some characters. This includes the X-Men. They're owned by 20th Century Fox, and Fox has been making X-Men movies for years, and that includes Deadpool and Logan. Fox also owns the rights to the Fantastic Four, hence why this family and all the characters associated with them are off limits as well. That includes the Silver Surfer and Doctor Doom. I guess that might be a good thing. Otherwise, someone might have noticed that the Human Torch looked pretty similar to Captain America. Changes to Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch. The original story of Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch is very different in the movies than they are in the comics. You see, in the comics, they thought that they were mutants. In fact, they grew up as the children of Magneto. In the end, the comics do reveal that they aren't really mutants and that they aren't Magneto's children, but their powers do still revolve around them growing up with him and working with him. Obviously, they couldn't keep the backstory in the movies because they aren't allowed to mention X-Men at all. Never mind make one of the biggest characters of the X-Men the father to the children who joined forces with the Avengers. So instead, they're two children who were orphans that Hydra took in and experimented on with the Infinity Stone. That is what gave them their powers. They worked for Hydra but then changed sides to work with the Avengers. I'm glad they just changed their backstory instead of just eliminating the characters completely though. I can't imagine the MCU without the Scarlet Witch. Can you? Would you love to see a crossover between the X-Men and the Avengers? I know I would. Which character from the comics would you love to see pop up in the MCU? Let me know in the comments section down below. Up next, we're going to see who Jarvis was in the comics, how Hawkeye has changed, and so much more. Let's get to Jarvis as a human. In the comics, Jarvis is an important part of the Avengers family because he's the butler in the Avengers mansion, and he's around for many years. But in the movies, Jarvis is an artificial intelligence that Tony creates to work with him and help him, like a digital butler. He's still a beloved character, just not entirely human. Although it has to be said that in Marvel's Agent Carter, which in my opinion was seriously underrated, Jarvis was a real person. He was Howard Stark's butler and probably the reason that Tony calls his AI Jarvis later on. It was a nice way to bring a little bit of that history back into the MCU. Later on, Jarvis the AI turns into Vision, so he completely changes there too. How is Hawkeye different? I love Hawkeye in the movies, and Jeremy Renner is incredible in the role, but they don't give him enough time and they don't really scratch the surface of how cool the character is in the comics. The new show has started to give him his proper space, but there's still quite a lot in the movies that is different from the comics. In the comics, he's been in a bunch of different superhero groups, like the Avengers, but also in the Defenders, the Thunderbolts, and many more. He was a villain at one stage, and he has had a few relationships with different superhero women. Another pretty big thing about the comics is that Hawkeye is deaf and needs high-tech hearing aids to hear normally. He wasn't deaf in the comics, but spoiler, they might be changing that thanks to the show. He's just as witty as he is in the movies, and he's just as awesome. It was also a bit of a disappointment to me that they didn't use this character more in the movies, but luckily for us, they're changing that thanks to the show. I think it's about time he really gets the spotlight on him. Black Widow also changed. We have always known that Natasha Romanoff is an incredible character. She's a strong woman and an incredible warrior. They did use a lot of her backstory in the movies, like the fact that she's a super spy and a trained killer, but she changed her life around to become a hero. The big thing that they did change from the comics into the movies is that in the comics, she was a scientifically engineered spy and has some superpowers thanks to experimentation. She has stronger senses and a bit of super healing and even some super strength. She might not be as massively enhanced as Captain America is, but she does still have superpowers. In the movies, Black Widow is just an incredibly well-trained warrior with awesome senses. They never say she has superpowers, but they do allow her to do some really incredible stuff. And lastly, how civil the Civil War was. And another big thing they changed is how everyone kind of held back in Civil War. In the comics, there was a huge amount of heroes that fought against each other, and no one held back at all. That's why a school was blown up and Cap even died. It was much, much worse in the comics. In the movie, everyone still cared and they didn't really want to hurt their friends. Emotion dictated a lot. Still, I don't think fans would have liked too much violence between them. It might have been for the best. Let me know down in the comments if there are any changes that bug you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.